Neuromusical aspects of music cognition. In our textbook, we learn that music cognition is concerned with how we make sense of the music that we hear. Similar to the punchline of a joke, this is where the music tends to make sense. Like the cadence in the music, where there is a coming back to home or an exposition, conflict, and resolution in the music. In other words, the music is telling a story. Now, the mind is not exactly simple. It's more like a kaleidoscope. There are many different levels and channels and layers that work together. Your cultural background, your age, gender, your training, your experience, your personality, your environment that you grew up in. All those things make a difference on how you perceive music. The Gestalt principles were advanced by Wertheimer, Kohler and Kafka, and it deals with cognitive organization of my perception of the world and another's perception of the world. It's a big picture. It's an overall viewpoint that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The figure ground is related because it talks about the foreground and background relationships. So in music, each person's ear focuses on some part of the music. Again, based upon our background and our personal life experiences. It makes something central, and that becomes the foreground. In the central figure, there are other things that are also in the background, but they can become a focus when we switch our attention to that. The law of Pragnance says that psychological organizations will be as good as the prevailing conditions allow. As a teacher, I think of a classroom that could be very loud, noisy, disorganized. It's not a good area for learning. And those conditions will affect our learning and will affect our memory. Individuals tend to organize their perceptual environment in a predictable manner based upon your past experiences. For example, if you've never heard a tritone, for me, that was one that threw me for a loop. It sounded wrong. The law of proximity similarity says that phrases that are similar are likely to be grouped together. The common direction means music moving in a common direction, like a scale passage. It will be grouped together. It also applies to rhythm and other aspects of music. So I think of it as reducing fractions in math. The 6/8 time signature, for example, we feel that in two. It is felt in two groups of beats, two groups of three. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we feel it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Two groups of three. And as conductors, we count and we conduct in a two pattern. We teach our students to think of it as groups of three and put a little bit of emphasis there. That provides a little bit of simplicity. We're grouping things in their simplest form. The law of closure says that incomplete items are perceived as closed. So ending on the second scale degree means in our minds internally, we audiate, meaning that we use our inner hearing, which we'll talk a little bit about later, to resolve that back to the tonic. Or at the end of a movie, you don't know what's going to happen to those characters, but you sort of draw your own conclusions to make that come to a close. The auditory scene says that the ability to separate ambient sounds in your environment helps you to create a little bit of a scheme. That's a mental picture of something that you learn that you regularly use. So it's just like a picture. It's just like a scene in a drama, in a play. You're making an auditory scene. Now, we regularly use social security numbers. We regularly use birthdays. Those become schemes, and that sort of sets a scene for us. The Zabaldone was popular in the 18th century. It contains stock musical phrases. Composers found creative ways to use those phrases to make themes in their new music. Now, We hear hip hop music and we hear R&B, even pop and some country music. They sample. Sample means they use music from the 70s, jazz music, funk music, and soul music. They use the bass lines, they use the chord structures, um, laying that down as a background, and then they sing a layer of music on top of that, or they rap on top of that. That's similar to that is Zabaldon. Also, Jamie Aebersold books is very popular as one example of jazz improv books. I own several of them and use them. There are schemes there. There are improvisational notes. There are ideas. And those ideas, you can use those later on in your music. So for memory, you hear different schemes and different scenes. And with that, you're able to apply it to the music. That way, you are improving your memory because I just heard a pattern. I just heard a theme. I recognize that theme. That's going to help me memorize what I see and what I hear. Now, memory is experienced in every level of music. Most theorists categorize memory as short or long term. An example of short-term memory is looking up a phone number on your telephone or on Google or in a phone book. You only remember that as long as you need to use it. In short-term memory, your electrical neurofibers are firing in the brain. They begin to dissipate after 30 seconds. They could last a few minutes. It could last as long as a few hours. But because you don't need it, you lose that. Long-term memory requires more neurofibers at work. It is encoding in the brain in permanent storage. So the myelin is being created and it is wrapping itself around those fibers and it is going deeper and deeper. And the more myelin that is used, it creates more memory. How to create long-term memory? We know this as musicians: practice, practice, practice. Rehearsal is significant. But what does it mean? Going back to the analogy of a phone number. If it's my grandmother's phone number, I know I have to remember that because I have to call and I'll be talking to her many times throughout the years. So I'm going to create a memory. I'm going to say that over and over. I'm going to read that. I'm going to type it into my phone. And because it is significant, I am going to remember that phone number. In addition to the importance of rehearsal, when a material has some significance given to it, even emotion, as we will talk about later, it is easier for coding into the long-term memory as long as there's a lack of interference. There's not a lot of things that interrupt the rehearsal. As we talked about earlier, the noisy, disorganized, poorly lit, hot, or cold classroom, those things are bad for interfering with what we're trying to learn. So creating long-term memory, going into this study, I knew about chunking. I learned a lot of other things, but chunking I was familiar with. That phone number, we don't remember 10 individual numbers. We remember groups. Remember the area code, the prefix, the suffix of the number. Similar to a locker number, not just 6 numbers, but groups of 2, or a section of the music. We remember it because it is chunked together. Now, Miller in 1956 advanced the theory of magic number 7, meaning that memory can be limited to 7 separate pieces of information. So the long number that you see here, 5469-8018-3246-7819, that becomes a credit card number. 4 groups of 4 numbers. Now we can remember that because each chunk, each section is its own individual piece. And I can remember 1 piece, 2 pieces, 3 pieces. I can remember that 4 pieces of information much easier than just one long string of numbers. Music, very similar. We chunk that together like a scale passage or something similar to a scale passage. It's an example of the auditory schema that we talked about. are declarative and procedural memory. Declarative, in my example, declarative memory, memorizing facts and data. For me, I learned steel drums when I went to college. The setup of the steel drum is unlike any piano or marimba or xylophone or any other instrument. Finding out where those notes were hard. Now, when I learned my scales, I knew that a C scale was C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That was my declarative memory. However, I didn't know how to find those notes on the drum. So I had to form a procedure. And for me, playing C, D, E was like drawing a backwards seven. C, D, E. It was drawing a backwards seven for me. So I could figure that out. And F, G, A, B was drawing a four from the bottom, top, left, and right. Now I had something to connect it to. And we're going to watch a video that's going to explain a little bit more about what declarative memory is.
Declarative memory is a broad term which can include both episodic and semantic memory. An easy way to remember declarative memory is that you declare or communicate your memory to another. For example, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That is a declarative tidbit that some of you may have learned in school. Two other distinctions in the types of memory are explicit memory and implicit memory. Some psychologists refer to declarative memory as a type of explicit memory. Again, this is our ability to consciously recall facts and events. So we would say in some cases that semantic and episodic memories are types of explicit memory. We're able to describe and recall events and things that we've learned in the past. Now let's go take a closer look at implicit memory.
Audiation refers to the inner hearing of musical sounds, pitch, rhythm, and timbre, and it requires a deeper understanding of music. And for me, using the steel drum example once again, when I improvise on the steel drum, I audiate all the time. I am hearing things. Now I'm using my memory to recall maybe something I heard on a CD or maybe something I heard on the radio. I am using my visual memory to see a pattern that I have practiced in the past. I visually see it in my mind. I can visually see it on the paper. And my kinesthetic memory, my muscle memory kicks into effect when I begin to play, because the steel drum is not set up similar to a piano, as I said before. So I'm using my kinesthetic and my muscle memory to remember the feeling of playing those notes. All those things are important, and audiation plays a big part in memorization. There are three aspects of memory: knowledge, strategy, and effort. So strategy begins when you analyze a piece of music. You're breaking it down into different chunks. You're beginning to find things that are similar. It may be an ostinato repeated pattern. It could be a certain chord structure. It could be a 6-2-5-1 or a 3-6-2-5-1 or 4-2. It could be some sort of harmonic or rhythmic structure that you memorize. And that knowledge you take into the practice room with you to make a plan. You put those strategies together because you've taken notes, you've written on the music, you figured out a few things that will help you, a couple of cues, and you use those cues and you put in your hard work. That develops your memory. Now, in Sloboda's book, Music in the Mind, from 2007, he gave a good foundation for updated findings in neuroscience and cognitive science by ensuring a specific approach, scientific approach to understanding musical phenomena, making sure it was not disconnected from real-world musicians. Perception, he says, is regarded as a collection of procedures for processing sound and musical data. From this point, researchers mainly focus on constructing abstract representations of musical structures and how these representations are stored in memory. A couple of studies that I found very interesting: an autobiographical memory study was done by Sloboda in 2005 in another one of his books. And it studies a person's own musical memories throughout their lifespan. He found that experiences connected with strong emotion have relevance. The autobiographical method is valuable because you're telling your own story, your own life experiences, your own musical experiences. Sometimes it is restrictive when you have an experimental structure, but autobiographical gives you the opportunity to share. The study gave those participants a chance to reveal the experiences that were connected with the music, how the events were connected with the music, and how emotions were connected. People with peak experiences more likely pursue music for the rest of their life. And a quick story for me, in high school, I had one of those peak musical experiences. After struggling to perform, I finally was able to join the group of people who got a wanted district and a wanted state and got to travel and do all those wonderful things. That experience for me at a teenage uh, age group, that showed me I could do it. If I worked hard, if I got help, if I had discipline, I could accomplish something. It was an awesome experience for me. And it definitely shaped how I pursue music for the rest of my life. So as teachers, we have to consider how we can create those peak experiences for all of our students, because every child did not have such an experience. And that's what they found out in an autobiographical study. Now, the funny thing is, almost none of those experiences occurred in an atmosphere of distress or anxiety, and school was the least popular environment. I even think back to Dr. Parisi sharing a story with us over the summer of how he had a negative experience in choir and he was called out by name, and it really took him aback and set him back. Again, speaking about memory, there was a recall study by Sloboda in 2005. 8 participants, they were recalling a folk melody that was repeatedly presented to them. Those were all volunteer samples. The sample was volunteer pool from the Department of Psychology in the City of Liverpool College of Higher Education, age 19 through 22. 4 of those subjects had no musical tuition, but they enjoyed listening to music. The other 4 were classically trained and performed classical music. They recorded several sequences of piano performances of folk melodies. Each subject listened to each sequence 6 times in a row. Each time they sang back the melody that they heard on na, la, or another syllable, and that was recorded for analysis as well. We found that structural knowledge helped the recall. In almost every recall, they understood it was a quadruple meter, which suggested that meter was the primary framework for melodic comprehension and recall. Meter was the basis. They were able to recall the rhythm, but it was not exact, and half of the time, a substitute rhythm was used. There was a large variance in melodic and harmonic recall. And as you might expect, the harmonic recall was higher with those who had musical tuition. Harmonic recall was not associated with melodic, but it was associated with the meter. Sometimes a substitute melody was created. The major difference in the trained and non-trained participants in the study was the harmonic recall. And the recall did not improve throughout the 6 trials. And what does this mean? As a music teacher, I know that memorization of music is an important part of learning. I also understand from this study that meter perhaps should be one of the first things that is taught, which is interesting because in many of our method books, meter is not the first thing. It's note recognition and fingering or hand position and how to create the notes. So perhaps there is some additional work that must be done on my part to advance recall and memorization. I was reinforced with my chunking, those theories. I was also reinforced with understanding that emotion and experience has a lot to do with memorization. So I'll approach this school year a little bit differently. Thank you for your time.